Imagine a king so genetically destroyed by centuries of royal inbreeding that his jaw jutted out so far from his face that he couldn't close his mouth to chew food. Picture a ruler whose tongue was so massively swollen that even his own courtiers couldn't understand a single word he tried to speak. Visualize an emperor whose body was so twisted by genetic defects that he drooled constantly, struggled to walk, and suffered violent seizures that left him unconscious on the marble floors of his own palace. This wasn't some fictional monster from a medieval nightmare. This was Carlos II of Spain, the last Habsburg king, and the living proof that royal bloodlines could become genetic disasters when families spent centuries marrying their own relatives to keep power within the family. If royal genetic catastrophes fascinate you as much as they fascinate me, please subscribe to the channel, because today you're going to discover how the most powerful dynasty in European history created the most genetically deformed king who ever lived. Carlos couldn't eat solid food because his lower jaw protruded so dramatically that his teeth couldn't meet properly. Court records show that palace servants had to mash his meals into liquid form just so he could swallow without choking. When foreign ambassadors visited the Spanish court, they reported back to their kings in absolute horror, describing a monarch who looked more like a grotesque caricature than the ruler of a global empire. But here's what makes Carlos's story even more disturbing. This wasn't some tragic accident or random genetic mutation. This was the inevitable result of a calculated breeding strategy that the Habsburg family had been pursuing for over 200 years. They believed that marrying within their own bloodline would keep their royal power pure and concentrated. Instead, they created what modern geneticists call the most inbred royal family in human history. The numbers are absolutely terrifying. While most people have a coefficient of inbreeding close to 0, Carlos II had a coefficient of 0, 254, meaning he was more inbred than the average child born to a brother and sister. His family tree wasn't really a tree at all. It was more like a tangled mess of repeated names where uncles married nieces and cousins married cousins, generation after generation. Contemporary accounts describe a king who looked like a walking medical emergency. The Venetian ambassador wrote that Carlos had a face that was more fit for a museum of natural curiosities than for a royal throne. French diplomats reported that his appearance was so shocking that ladies of the court would faint when meeting him for the first time. And this genetically catastrophic man wasn't just some minor noble hidden away in a castle somewhere. He was the absolute ruler of the largest empire on earth. Spanish territories stretched across Europe, dominated the Americas, and controlled vast wealth from colonial trade. Yet all of this incredible power rested in the hands of a king who couldn't even speak clearly enough to give basic orders to his own servants. But if you thought that Carlos's physical deformities were disturbing, the truth gets much darker when you discover how his family created this genetic nightmare through centuries of the most twisted marriage arrangements in royal history. To understand how Carlos II became such a genetic catastrophe, we need to go back to the very beginning of the Habsburg family's rise to power, because this royal dynasty didn't just accidentally stumble into inbreeding. They turned it into their official family strategy for world domination. The Habsburgs started as relatively minor German nobles in the 13th century, but they had one incredible talent. They knew how to marry their way to the top. While other royal families were busy fighting bloody wars to expand their territories, the Habsburgs perfected what historians call strategic matrimony. They literally married their way into controlling most of Europe. Their family motto said it all: "Let others wage war. You, happy Austria, marry." And marry they did. Within just a few generations, Habsburg marriages had secured them control of Austria, Hungary, Bohemia, Spain, the Netherlands, and vast chunks of Italy. By the 16th century, they controlled more territory than the Roman Empire at its peak. But here's where their brilliant strategy started to become a genetic nightmare. The Habsburgs realized that every time they married outside their family, they were essentially giving away pieces of their power to other royal houses. So they made a calculated decision that would doom their bloodline. They would only marry within their own family to keep all that incredible wealth and territory concentrated in Habsburg hands. Charles V, who ruled the Holy Roman Empire and Spain in the early 1500s, established the family policy that would eventually create Carlos II. Historical records show that Charles explicitly instructed his descendants to marry only other Habsburgs. He believed this would create an unbreakable chain of Habsburg power that would last forever. And at first, it seemed to work perfectly. Habsburg marriages created a family network that controlled European politics for centuries. When a Habsburg king in Spain needed military support, he could call on his Habsburg cousins in Austria. When Habsburg territories in the Netherlands faced rebellion, other Habsburg relatives would send troops and money. But the family completely ignored the biological consequences of their marriage strategy. Medieval royal families had no understanding of genetics, heredity, or the dangers of inbreeding. They thought that royal blood was literally different from common blood, and that mixing it with inferior bloodlines would weaken their divine right to rule. Court physicians of the time actually encouraged Habsburg inbreeding, believing that it would concentrate the family's royal essence. Medical records from the period show that doctors told Habsburg parents that marrying their children to close relatives would produce stronger, more pure royal offspring. The irony is absolutely devastating. The very strategy that made the Habsburgs the most powerful family in European history was simultaneously destroying their genetic health with each generation. Every Habsburg marriage to another Habsburg doubled down on genetic defects, passing along harmful mutations and amplifying genetic weaknesses. By the time Carlos II was born in 1661, the Habsburg family tree looked like a genetic horror story. But the family had no idea what genetic nightmare they were creating through 2 centuries of systematic inbreeding. If you think the Habsburg marriage strategy sounds disturbing in theory, wait until you see how they actually executed it in practice. Because the Habsburg family tree reads like a genetics textbook on everything you should never do when choosing a marriage partner. Let's start with Carlos II's great-great-grandfather, Philip II of Spain, who married 4 times and managed to marry within his own family 3 out of those 4 times. His first wife was his cousin Maria Manuela of Portugal. His 4th wife was his niece Anna of Austria. Yes, he literally married his brother's daughter. When Philip II died, court records showed he already suffered from severe gout and other health problems that modern geneticists now recognize as early signs of Habsburg genetic deterioration. But Philip II's family mistakes were nothing compared to what came next. His son Philip III married Margaret of Austria, who wasn't just his cousin. She was his double cousin, related to him through both her mother's and father's bloodlines. Austrian court documents from their wedding describe Margaret as having the distinctive Habsburg lip, an early version of the jaw deformity that would eventually destroy Carlos II. Then came Philip IV, Carlos II's father, and this is where the genetic situation became absolutely catastrophic. Philip IV married Elizabeth of France, who was his cousin, and their family tree was already so tangled with repeated Habsburg marriages that their children were essentially guaranteed to inherit multiple copies of the same genetic defects. But the most devastating decision came when Philip IV's first wife died, and he needed to remarry to secure the succession. Instead of bringing fresh genetic material into the bloodline by marrying outside the family, he chose Mariana of Austria, his own niece, the daughter of his sister Maria Anna. Let me put this in perspective. Mariana of Austria was simultaneously Carlos II's mother and his first cousin. Her father, Ferdinand III of Austria, was Carlos II's grandfather on his mother's side and his great-uncle on his father's side. Contemporary genealogical records show that Mariana and Philip IV shared 25% of their genes, the same amount as half-siblings. Spanish court physicians documented Mariana's own health problems during her pregnancy with Carlos. She suffered from severe depression, frequent fainting spells, and what doctors called nervous disorders. All symptoms that modern medical researchers recognize as likely results of Habsburg inbreeding affecting her own neurological development. The mathematical reality is terrifying. By the time Carlos II was conceived, his family tree contained only 4 great-great-great-grandmothers instead of the normal 16. Where most people's ancestry branches outward as you go back in time, Carlos's ancestry kept folding back in on itself, concentrating the same genetic material over and over again. Diplomatic correspondence from other European courts shows that foreign royalty were already commenting on Habsburg genetic problems by the 1650s. The French ambassador to Madrid wrote that the Spanish royal family showed concerning signs of degeneration and that their children were afflicted with various maladies unknown to other royal houses. By the time Carlos was born in 1661, the Habsburg genetic experiment had been running for over 2 centuries, and the accumulated damage was about to produce the most devastating example of royal inbreeding in human history. When Carlos II was born on November 6, 1661, Spanish court physicians immediately knew something was catastrophically wrong, but they had no idea they were looking at the living result of the most extensive royal inbreeding experiment in European history. The birth itself was a medical nightmare. Palace records show that Mariana of Austria endured an agonizing labor that lasted over 30 hours, and when Carlos finally emerged, the attending doctors were shocked by what they saw. The newborn prince had a massive, protruding lower jaw that prevented him from closing his mouth properly, and his tongue was so enlarged that it filled his entire oral cavity. But the most terrifying discovery came when Carlos tried to feed. Normal newborns instinctively know how to suckle, but Carlos couldn't create the proper seal with his lips due to his jaw deformity. Court wet nurses reported that feeding sessions took hours because milk would constantly dribble out of his mouth. Spanish medical records from his first weeks of life describe a baby who couldn't perform the most basic human function of eating without assistance. Dr. Juan de Cabrera, the royal physician, wrote detailed reports about Carlos's condition that still survive in Spanish archives today. He documented that the infant prince showed abnormal cranial proportions, excessive drooling, and an inability to control tongue movement. But what terrified the doctor most was that Carlos seemed to have difficulty recognizing faces and responding to sounds, early signs of the intellectual disabilities that would plague him for life. Guys, if you're loving this journey through royal genetic disasters, please subscribe to the channel, because what I'm about to reveal next will blow your mind and show you just how far royal inbreeding could destroy a human being. Spanish court astrologers tried to explain Carlos's condition through supernatural means, claiming he was born under malevolent celestial influences. But the real explanation was written in his genes. Carlos had inherited multiple copies of the same genetic defects from both sides of his family tree because his parents were so closely related. Modern genetic analysis of the Habsburg family tree shows that Carlos inherited a perfect storm of recessive genetic disorders. When both parents carry the same harmful recessive genes, which is almost guaranteed when they're closely related, their children have a 25% chance of inheriting 2 copies of each defective gene, making the genetic disorder fully manifest. By age 6 months, Carlos's condition had worsened dramatically. Palace tutors reported that he couldn't sit up without support. His head wobbled uncontrollably, and he showed no signs of developing normal motor skills. Spanish court records describe a child who seemed more like a broken doll than a future king. The political implications were already becoming clear to Spanish advisors. Foreign ambassadors who visited the court sent worried dispatches back to their home countries, reporting that the heir to the Spanish throne appeared to be severely disabled. The Venetian ambassador wrote that the young prince presents such alarming symptoms that doubt exists whether he will survive to adulthood, much less be capable of ruling an empire. But what no one at the Spanish court could have predicted was that Carlos's genetic problems were just beginning to reveal themselves, and the worst symptoms were yet to emerge. As Carlos grew from infant to child, the genetic nightmare encoded in his DNA began to reveal itself in increasingly horrifying ways, and the most visible symbol of Habsburg inbreeding was developing right there on his face for the entire Spanish court to witness. The Habsburg jaw, known medically as mandibular prognathism, wasn't just a cosmetic problem. It was a skeletal deformity that made basic human functions nearly impossible. By age 5, Carlos's lower jaw had grown so dramatically that it protruded almost an inch beyond his upper jaw, creating a grotesque underbite that left his mouth permanently hanging open. Spanish court portraitists struggled to paint flattering images of their future king. Art historians have documented how royal painters were forced to use increasingly creative angles and lighting to minimize Carlos's facial deformities in official portraits. Even with these artistic tricks, surviving paintings from his childhood show a boy whose jaw dominated his entire face in an absolutely unnatural way. But the real horror wasn't how Carlos looked. It was how this deformity affected his daily survival. Palace servants reported that eating became a torturous ordeal that could take hours for a single meal. Since Carlos couldn't bring his teeth together properly, he was completely unable to chew solid food. Court records show that royal chefs had to prepare specially modified meals, mashing everything into liquid or paste-like consistency. Even drinking presented major challenges. The gap between Carlos's upper and lower jaws meant that liquids would constantly spill out of his mouth. Palace attendants had to develop special feeding techniques, tilting Carlos's head at specific angles and using modified cups with narrow spouts to help him swallow without drowning in his own drinks. Contemporary accounts describe mealtimes as public humiliations for the young prince. The French ambassador reported witnessing a royal dinner where Carlos spent over an hour attempting to consume what should have been a simple meal, with food and drink constantly dribbling down his chin onto his royal clothing. Foreign dignitaries wrote back to their home courts expressing shock and pity at the sight of the Spanish heir struggling with basic human functions. The Habsburg jaw also created severe dental problems that compounded Carlos's eating difficulties. Court physicians documented that his misaligned bite caused his teeth to wear down unevenly, creating painful dental issues that made any attempt at chewing even more agonizing. Spanish medical records show that Carlos suffered from constant tooth pain and recurring dental abscesses throughout his childhood. What made the situation even more tragic was that Carlos's jaw deformity was progressively worsening. Palace physicians noted that his lower jaw continued growing at an abnormal rate even as he reached adolescence, making his facial deformity more pronounced with each passing year. They tried various medieval medical interventions, including primitive orthodontic devices and dietary modifications, but nothing could correct the fundamental skeletal malformation. Spanish courtiers began developing elaborate protocols to manage Carlos's eating difficulties during formal state functions. They created special dining schedules that allowed Carlos to eat privately before official meals, so he could maintain some royal dignity during public events. Yet eating wasn't his only impossible daily task, because the same genetic defects that destroyed Carlos's jaw had also created another devastating problem that would make communication nearly as difficult as eating. If Carlos's eating problems weren't devastating enough for a future king, the same genetic deformities that destroyed his jaw also made it nearly impossible for him to speak clearly, creating a communication nightmare that would define his entire reign and humiliate the Spanish monarchy on the international stage. Carlos's speech problems weren't just about pronunciation. They were about fundamental anatomical failures that made verbal communication almost impossible. His massively enlarged tongue, combined with his protruding jaw and perpetually open mouth, created what court physicians described as unintelligible utterances rather than actual speech. Palace records from Carlos's childhood tutors paint a heartbreaking picture of a young prince who desperately wanted to communicate, but whose genetic defects made it nearly impossible. Father Gabriel de Cusa, Carlos's language instructor, wrote detailed reports describing how the prince would become frustrated to the point of tears when people couldn't understand what he was trying to say. By adolescence, Carlos had developed what courtiers politely called the royal speech, but foreign visitors described it much more bluntly. The Venetian ambassador reported that Carlos's attempts at conversation sounded like the mumblings of a person with severe dental obstructions, accompanied by excessive salivation that made comprehension nearly impossible. The Spanish court was forced to develop an entire system of interpretation just so their king could communicate with his own government.
Senior courtiers who had spent years around Carlos learned to decipher his speech patterns, essentially becoming royal translators within the palace. Court records show that important state meetings required these interpreter courtiers to repeat Carlos's statements in understandable Spanish. International diplomacy became a source of constant embarrassment for the Spanish monarchy.
When foreign ambassadors presented their credentials to King Carlos, many reported back to their home countries that they couldn't understand a single word the Spanish king had said during the formal ceremonies. The French ambassador wrote that Carlos's attempts at diplomatic conversation were so garbled by his speech impediments that successful communication required written correspondence even during face-to-face meetings. Spanish officials developed elaborate workarounds to manage Carlos's communication problems during state functions. They created scripted responses that Carlos could memorize and attempt to deliver for formal occasions, though even these prepared statements were often incomprehensible to visitors. Palace protocols show that important royal pronouncements had to be delivered by court officials rather than the king himself. The speech problems also created massive security and administrative challenges. In an era when royal commands were transmitted verbally through a chain of courtiers and officials, having a king whose instructions were unintelligible created constant confusion about state policy. Spanish governmental records from Carlos's reign show numerous instances where conflicting interpretations of the king's verbal orders led to administrative chaos. What made Carlos's speech impediments even more tragic was that contemporary accounts suggest he possessed normal intelligence in many areas and desperately wanted to participate in royal duties. Court observers noted that Carlos would often gesture frantically or write notes when his spoken words failed to convey his meaning, showing a mind trapped inside a genetically damaged body. But physical deformities and communication problems were just the beginning of Carlos's genetic nightmare, because the same inbreeding that destroyed his jaw and speech had also created neurological problems that would make ruling an empire nearly impossible. Just when you thought Carlos's physical deformities were the worst consequences of Habsburg inbreeding, the genetic damage had also devastated his neurological system, creating a king whose mind was as broken as his body, and whose violent seizures would terrorize the Spanish court. Carlos suffered from what court physicians called the falling sickness, epilepsy so severe that his seizures could strike without warning, leaving the king of the world's largest empire convulsing helplessly on the palace floors while horrified courtiers watched their monarch's body betray him in the most public and humiliating ways possible. Spanish medical records document seizures that were both frequent and violent. Dr. Juan de Cabrera recorded episodes where Carlos would suddenly collapse during royal ceremonies, his body racked by convulsions so intense that it took multiple courtiers to hold him down and prevent him from injuring himself. These weren't brief episodes. Some seizures lasted for over 10 minutes, leaving Carlos unconscious and disoriented for hours afterward. The unpredictability of Carlos's epilepsy made royal duties nearly impossible. Palace protocols show that formal state functions had to include contingency plans for sudden seizures, with court physicians standing ready and private chambers prepared nearby where the king could recover away from public view. Spanish governmental records reveal numerous instances where important state meetings were abandoned mid-session because Carlos suffered seizures in front of foreign ambassadors. But the epilepsy was just one symptom of deeper neurological damage. Court tutors documented that Carlos struggled with what we would now recognize as significant intellectual disabilities. Royal education records show that even basic literacy remained challenging throughout his life. Carlos could barely read simple documents and had extreme difficulty with mathematical concepts that previous Spanish kings had mastered as children. The Spanish Council of State was forced to develop elaborate administrative systems to compensate for their king's cognitive limitations. Government documents from Carlos's reign show that major policy decisions required extensive written summaries with simplified language. And even then, court advisors often had to make crucial state decisions without meaningful royal input because Carlos couldn't comprehend the complexities involved. Contemporary accounts describe a king whose mental state fluctuated unpredictably. The Austrian ambassador reported that Carlos could seem relatively normal during brief conversations, but any sustained mental effort would trigger confusion, agitation, or even seizures. French diplomatic correspondence describes Carlos as having the intellectual capacity of a child trapped in the body of a king. Spanish court records reveal the political chaos caused by Carlos's neurological problems. During his seizures and recovery periods, effective government required regency councils to assume royal authority, creating constitutional crises about who actually held power in the Spanish Empire. These temporary power transfers became so frequent that foreign governments began negotiating directly with Spanish ministers, rather than attempting to work with the king himself. What made Carlos's neurological problems even more tragic was that they seemed to worsen with age, rather than stabilize. Palace physicians documented increasing frequency and severity of seizures throughout his 20s and 30s, along with progressive deterioration in his already limited cognitive abilities. Yet, perhaps the most devastating consequence of Carlos's genetic nightmare was still to come. Because the same inbreeding that destroyed his body and mind had also made it impossible for him to fulfill the most basic royal duty of all, producing an heir to continue the dynasty. The ultimate nightmare of Habsburg inbreeding wasn't just that it had created a physically and mentally disabled king. It was that Carlos II appeared to be completely sterile, threatening to end the Spanish Habsburg dynasty forever and throwing the entire balance of European power into chaos. When Carlos married his first wife, Marie-Louise of Orléans, in 1679, the Spanish court desperately hoped that royal marriage might somehow overcome his obvious physical problems. But palace records from their wedding night reveal a shocking reality. Carlos was apparently incapable of consummating the marriage due to what court physicians delicately described as anatomical irregularities in the royal person. Spanish medical documents from this period, preserved in royal archives, show that court doctors conducted humiliating examinations of both Carlos and his wife to determine why no pregnancy occurred after months of marriage. Dr. Francisco Rancés wrote detailed reports describing Carlos's insufficient masculine development and notable deficiencies in reproductive capacity, medical terminology for what amounted to genetic-based infertility. The political panic was immediate and devastating. Spanish Council of State records show emergency meetings where government ministers discussed the constitutional crisis of a childless king. Without an heir, the Spanish Empire, which controlled territories across Europe, the Americas, and parts of Africa, faced the prospect of being divided among foreign claimants when Carlos died. After Marie-Louise died mysteriously in 1689, the Spanish court arranged a second marriage with Maria Anna of Neuburg, desperately hoping a different wife might somehow solve Carlos's fertility problems. But palace records from this second marriage tell the same story. No children, no pregnancies, and increasingly frantic efforts by court physicians to find medical solutions to what was fundamentally a genetic problem. The fertility investigations became increasingly desperate and invasive. Spanish medical records document that Carlos was subjected to various medieval treatments, including special diets, herbal remedies, and even primitive hormonal therapies using animal extracts. Court physicians consulted with foreign medical experts and even brought in folk healers, but nothing could overcome the basic biological reality that centuries of inbreeding had left Carlos genetically incapable of reproduction. International consequences were already becoming clear by the 1690s. European powers began maneuvering for position in an anticipated succession crisis, with France, Austria, and other major kingdoms preparing competing claims to Spanish territories. Diplomatic correspondence from this period shows that foreign governments were essentially writing off Carlos as a political factor and focusing on post-Habsburg scenarios. Spanish officials tried increasingly desperate measures to hide the succession crisis. They spread false rumors about possible pregnancies, staged fake medical examinations suggesting improved royal health, and even floated proposals for adopting distant relatives as potential heirs. Palace protocols show elaborate deceptions designed to maintain the illusion that Carlos might still father children. The irony was devastating. The same marriage strategy that had made the Habsburgs masters of Europe was now destroying their dynasty. 2 centuries of calculated inbreeding to concentrate royal power had produced a king so genetically damaged that he couldn't produce any offspring at all, making all that accumulated power meaningless. By the late 1690s, even Spanish courtiers privately acknowledged that Carlos would die childless, but no one could have predicted how rapidly the Spanish Empire itself would collapse once foreign powers realized that Habsburg Spain was ruled by a dying genetic dead end. As Carlos II's genetic condition continued deteriorating throughout the 1690s, the Spanish Empire that had once dominated the world began crumbling around their disabled king, proving that even the most powerful dynasty in history couldn't survive the biological consequences of centuries of inbreeding. Spanish governmental records from Carlos's final decade reveal an empire in administrative chaos. With a king who couldn't speak clearly, suffered frequent seizures, and lacked the cognitive ability to understand complex policy issues, actual governance fell to competing factions of nobles and ministers who fought constantly over who held real authority. Foreign powers quickly recognized Spain's weakness and began systematically dismantling Spanish territorial control. French forces seized Spanish fortifications along the Pyrenees. Dutch fleets captured Spanish colonial trading posts, and Austrian armies occupied Spanish territories in Italy. Diplomatic correspondence from this period shows that European rivals no longer bothered negotiating with Carlos directly, instead working around him to deal with his ministers. The economic consequences were devastating. Spanish colonial revenues declined dramatically as other European powers established competing trade routes and captured Spanish merchant vessels. Royal treasury records show that by 1699, the Spanish crown was essentially bankrupt, unable to maintain its military forces or defend its far-flung territories effectively. Carlos's personal deterioration accelerated in his final years, creating a grotesque spectacle of royal collapse. Palace physicians documented increasing frequency of seizures, progressive weight loss, and what appeared to be episodes of complete mental disconnection from reality. The Venetian ambassador reported that Carlos often seemed unaware of his surroundings during official meetings, staring blankly while drooling continuously. Spanish court records describe a king whose daily routine had become a medical emergency management system. Carlos required constant supervision to prevent him from injuring himself during seizures, needed assistance with basic functions like eating and dressing, and could no longer participate meaningfully in any royal ceremonies or state functions. By 1700, even Spanish officials privately acknowledged that their empire was effectively being ruled by a man who was barely capable of human communication, much less international diplomacy. Foreign ambassadors reported that meetings with Carlos had become surreal experiences where they would attempt formal diplomatic protocols with a king who might suddenly collapse, begin convulsing, or simply fail to respond to any questions. The end came on November 1st, 1700, when Carlos II died at age 38, after a final series of devastating seizures that left him unconscious for days. Spanish medical records show that his final illness involved multiple organ failures, likely related to the systemic genetic problems that had plagued his entire life. Carlos's death certificate, preserved in Spanish royal archives, lists the official cause as fever and convulsions, but modern medical analysis suggests that his death resulted from the accumulated effects of multiple genetic disorders caused by centuries of Habsburg inbreeding. Within hours of Carlos's death, Spanish officials opened his will to discover that he had named Philip of Anjou, a French prince, as his successor, essentially handing the Spanish Empire to France. This decision would trigger the most devastating European conflict of the early modern period, as other major powers refused to accept French control over Spanish territories. His death would trigger Europe's bloodiest war, but the real tragedy was that the Habsburg dynasty's genetic experiment had finally reached its inevitable conclusion. Carlos II's death didn't just end the Spanish Habsburg dynasty, it triggered the War of Spanish Succession, one of the bloodiest conflicts in European history, proving that the genetic consequences of royal inbreeding could literally reshape the entire continent and cost hundreds of thousands of lives. When European powers learned that Carlos had named Philip of Anjou as his successor, Austria, England, and the Netherlands immediately formed the Grand Alliance to prevent France from controlling both French and Spanish territories. The resulting war lasted from 1701 to 1714 and involved virtually every major European power in a conflict that stretched across 3 continents. Military historians estimate that over 400 Azumairo soldiers died in battles directly caused by the Spanish succession crisis, all because Habsburg inbreeding had produced a king so genetically damaged that he couldn't father children to continue his dynasty. Spanish territories were carved up among the victorious powers, permanently ending Spain's status as Europe's dominant empire. But the most fascinating aspect of Carlos II's story is what modern genetic science has revealed about the true extent of Habsburg inbreeding. In 2009, Spanish geneticist Gonzalo Alvarez conducted detailed analysis of the Habsburg family tree using modern computational methods, and the results were absolutely shocking. Alvarez's research showed that Carlos II had a coefficient of inbreeding of 0.254, higher than the average child born to brother and sister. To put this in perspective, Spanish royalty had achieved a level of genetic inbreeding that was virtually impossible through random chance. The Habsburgs had systematically concentrated harmful genetic mutations over 9 generations of calculated family marriages. The study identified specific genetic pathways that likely caused Carlos's physical and mental disabilities. Modern medical analysis suggests that Carlos suffered from combined pituitary hormone deficiency, mandibular prognathism, and probable renal tubular acidosis, all genetic conditions that become dramatically more likely when parents share significant amounts of DNA. What makes the Habsburg case even more remarkable is that geneticists can now trace exactly how specific harmful mutations accumulated through their family tree. Each generation of Habsburg cousin marriages doubled down on genetic defects, creating what researchers call a genetic bottleneck that made Carlos's disabilities virtually inevitable. The Habsburg inbreeding experiment serves as history's most documented proof of why genetic diversity is essential for human populations. modern royal families learned from the Habsburg disaster. Today's European monarchies actively seek marriages outside their immediate family circles, and genetic counseling is standard practice for royal marriages. Carlos II's story has become a cautionary tale taught in genetics courses worldwide, demonstrating how even the most powerful families in history couldn't overcome basic biological laws. The Spanish Habsburgs controlled vast wealth, territories across multiple continents, and seemingly unlimited political power. But none of that could save them from the genetic consequences of their own marriage choices. So what shocked you most about Carlos II's genetic nightmare? His physical deformities, his inability to speak clearly, or the fact that Habsburg inbreeding literally triggered a European war? Comment below because I read every single one. And if you want more stories about royal genetic disasters that destroyed entire dynasties, please subscribe to the channel and hit the bell, because next week I'm bringing you the story of another inbred royal family that will make the Habsburgs look normal.